After my husband passed away, I never told my son about the massive Wyoming ranch he left me or the $400,000 in hidden cash. 3 weeks later my son looked me right in the eye and calmly told me they were selling my house to lock me away in a facility. I did not argue. I did not cry. I just smiled because they had absolutely no idea what was sitting inside my bedroom closet. My name is Evelyn. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life I was invisible in the best possible way. I was a wife, a mother, and for 31 years I taught 3rd grade at a small elementary school outside Denver. My husband Walter was a quiet, steady man who worked as a land surveyor for most of his career, walking across empty fields with his equipment, measuring boundaries that other people would later build their entire lives on top of. We were married for 44 years. We met at a church picnic when I was 23, and he was so nervous he spilled lemonade down the front of his shirt while trying to introduce himself. I laughed so hard that people 2 tables over turned to look. He always said that laugh was the reason he fell in love with me, and I always said it was because he looked so ridiculous standing there dripping wet. We built a life together out of very little. We bought a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood, and over the decades we slowly turned it into something beautiful, room by room, weekend by weekend. Our first years together were not easy. Money was tight, and there were winters when we kept the thermostat low just to make sure there would be enough left over for groceries. But we never once felt poor because we had each other, and because Walter had a way of turning even the hardest days into something we could laugh about later. He used to say that a marriage is just 2 people agreeing over and over again to keep choosing each other, even on the days when choosing is hard. I believed him completely, and I still do. We had 1 son, Marcus. We gave him everything we could, sometimes more than we should have. We paid for his college education in full. We covered the down payment on his first condominium. When he married Danielle, we paid for half the wedding without a single complaint, because that is what parents do when they love their children more than they love their own comfort. I remember standing at the edge of the dance floor that night, watching him hold her close, feeling so certain that Walter and I had done something right, that we had raised a good man who would carry our love forward into his own family. I did not yet know how wrong that certainty would turn out to be. For years I told myself that Marcus was simply busy, that his silence and his short phone calls were just the natural distance that grows between a grown child and his aging parents. I told myself that Danielle was simply reserved, that her cold tone and her tight, polite smiles were just her personality. I made excuses for both of them the way mothers do, because the alternative was too painful to consider. Then 3 weeks ago, my entire world collapsed in a single afternoon. Walter had been fighting a sudden illness for only 11 days. It came on fast, a violent infection that spread through his body before the doctors could fully understand what they were dealing with. I sat beside his hospital bed every single day, holding his hand, praying with a desperation I did not know I still had inside me. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning, he was gone. Losing him felt like losing the ground beneath my feet. 44 years of shared mornings, shared meals, shared silence that never once felt empty. And suddenly all of it collapsed into a single quiet hospital room with beeping monitors that eventually stopped beeping at all. Marcus and Danielle came to the funeral. They said all the right words. They hugged me at the right moments. And then, within 2 days, they returned to their own lives, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too silent. I wandered from room to room, touching his reading chair, smelling the faint trace of his aftershave still lingering on his side of the closet, trying to figure out how a person is supposed to keep breathing when half of her heart has been buried in the ground. My neighbor Ruth, a woman I had known for over 20 years, started stopping by most afternoons with a casserole dish or a loaf of banana bread, sitting with me at the kitchen table just so I would not have to eat every meal in silence. She noticed things I had not let myself notice yet. She asked why Marcus had not called more often since the funeral. She asked why Danielle had shown up one afternoon with a tape measure, walking through the living room and jotting notes on a small pad without ever explaining why. I brushed it off at the time, telling Ruth that grief made people behave strangely, that surely my own son would never do anything to hurt me. Ruth did not argue with me, but I remember the way she looked at me before she left that evening, the way her eyes lingered a moment too long, as though she already suspected something I was not yet ready to face. Then last Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the funeral, my phone rang. It was a law office downtown, one of those old firms with a name carved into marble above the entrance. The woman on the phone asked me to come in as soon as possible regarding a private matter that Walter had arranged years earlier. I told her there must be some mistake. Walter and I shared everything. We sat at the kitchen table every single Sunday night and went over our finances together, down to the last dollar. There were no secrets between us. But I put on my navy blue dress, the one I usually saved for church, and I drove downtown with my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. I was led into a quiet office with tall bookshelves and a man behind the desk, who introduced himself as the attorney who had handled a private trust for Walter more than a decade earlier. He slid a small brass key across the desk toward me. He explained that it belonged to a safe deposit box at a private bank 2 blocks away, a box that had been opened in Walter's name alone, with me listed as the sole beneficiary in the event of his passing. I walked to that bank in a daze. A vault manager led me into a small windowless room with metal walls and left me alone with a heavy steel box sitting on a narrow table. My hands actually shook as I turned the key and lifted the lid. I expected old photographs, maybe a few letters. Perhaps his father's pocket watch, something sentimental he had simply forgotten to mention. What I found instead made my breath catch painfully in my throat. Stacks of neatly bound $100 bills filled nearly half the box. $400,000 in raw, untouched cash. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my own ears. But beneath the stacks of money sat a thick folder containing a legal deed and a handwritten letter in Walter's own careful, slanted handwriting. I unfolded the letter with trembling fingers and began to read. Walter explained everything in that letter, written nearly 12 years earlier, judging by the faded ink. He wrote that his estranged uncle, a man he had barely spoken to in decades, had died and left him a massive 5,000-acre cattle ranch in Wyoming, along with a sizable trust fund tied to it. Walter's uncle had built his fortune quietly and privately, and had chosen Walter as his sole heir simply because Walter was the only relative who had ever visited him without asking for anything in return. Walter wrote that he never told me because he did not want money to change the life we had built together. He wrote that he wanted our marriage to remain rooted in love and partnership rather than a hidden fortune, and he wanted Marcus to grow up believing that hard work, not inheritance, was the foundation of a good life. He said he always planned to tell me everything when the time felt right, and that if I was reading this letter, it meant he never got the chance, and that broke his heart more than anything else in the world. The final page of the folder revealed something even more staggering. The Wyoming ranch was not simply sitting empty in some quiet valley. It had been leased for years to a natural gas company, and that lease had been generating nearly $50,000 a month in royalty payments, all of it quietly accumulating inside a private trust that had never once been touched. I sat in that cold metal room for over an hour, sobbing into my own hands. Walter had carried this enormous secret for over a decade, silently protecting the humble life we shared, silently building a shield around our family without either of us ever suspecting it existed. I felt love and grief tangled together so tightly inside my chest that I could barely breathe. There was a final line in the letter that I read over and over again until the paper grew soft from my fingers. Walter had written that he trusted me to know exactly when and how to use this gift, and that whatever I decided, he wanted me to remember that our life together had never once needed money to feel rich. Reading those words felt like hearing his voice one final time, steady and calm, guiding me even from beyond the grave. I pressed the letter against my chest and let myself cry in a way I had not allowed since the funeral, grief and gratitude pouring out of me in equal measure. Eventually I gathered myself, placed everything carefully into my leather handbag, and walked back out into the gray afternoon light. As I drove home, my mind spun through every possibility. I thought about Marcus, about how he and Danielle had been quietly complaining for months about the cost of raising their children and the pressure of their mortgage. I thought about how much this money could change their lives. I thought about paying off their debts, about taking the grandchildren on the family vacation Walter always talked about but never had time to take. I thought about setting aside a trust for their college education. Grief was still sitting heavy on my chest, But for the first time in weeks, I also felt something close to purpose. I turned onto my quiet street, eager despite everything to share this bittersweet gift with my family. Then I saw it. A large unmarked moving truck parked crookedly in my driveway. My front door stood wide open. Cold, sick feeling dropped straight through my stomach. I gripped my handbag tightly and walked slowly up the path, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sight inside stopped me completely in my tracks. 3 strange men were carrying furniture out of my living room. One of them was wrapping the antique mirror Walter and I had bought on our 20th anniversary trip to Charleston. Another was dismantling the oak dining table where we had hosted every single Thanksgiving for the last 26 years. Boxes filled with my personal belongings were stacked in the hallway like debris after a storm. And standing right in the center of my living room, holding a clipboard and directing the movers with sharp, confident hand gestures, were my son Marcus and his wife Danielle. I stood frozen in my own doorway, completely invisible to them for a long, aching moment. My own child was tearing apart my home without a single phone call, without a single word of warning. I cleared my throat loudly. Marcus turned around. For a brief flash I saw genuine panic cross his face, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by a smooth, practiced smile. "Mom," he said, his voice syrupy and rehearsed. "We did not think you would be back so soon. We thought you were meeting with the lawyer about the estate paperwork all afternoon." "What exactly is happening here?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I possibly could despite the fury building in my chest. "Why are strangers taking apart my house without asking me first?" One of the movers brushed past me carrying a box labeled kitchen in my own handwriting, the same box I had used to pack Christmas ornaments every December for the last 15 years. I watched it disappear out the front door and felt something inside me crack. Danielle stepped forward smoothly, resting a manicured hand on my forearm in a gesture that was meant to look comforting but felt more like a warning. "Evelyn," she said gently, projecting her voice just enough for the movers to hear. "Please try to stay calm. We are only trying to help you. We know how difficult these past few weeks have been." "Help me," I repeated, staring at the chaos around me. "This is not help, Danielle. This is my home. The home your father-in-law and I paid off with our own hands over 4 decades. Marcus sighed heavily and reached for a glossy brochure sitting on the coffee table. He held it out toward me with an expression of manufactured pity that made my stomach twist. "We have to be realistic, Mom," he said softly, stepping closer. "You are almost 70 years old now, living alone in a 5-bedroom house. It is simply too much for you to manage by yourself. You have been wandering around like a ghost since Dad passed. It is not safe for you to be here alone anymore." He slid the brochure across the table. The cover showed elderly people sitting on a patchy lawn in front of a low, gray building. The bold letters read Restful Pines Senior Care Center. It was not a comfortable retirement community. It was a state-run facility, the kind of place families use when they simply do not want the burden of caring for someone anymore. "We have decided it is time," Marcus continued, his voice hardening slightly beneath the fake warmth. "We are selling the house. It is the best thing for you." Danielle stepped up behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders, offering me a small, satisfied smile. She truly believed she was looking at a broken, grieving widow who would simply fold under the pressure and sign anything they placed in front of her. For one brief, foolish moment, I actually felt sorry for them. I looked at my only son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the boy I had stayed up with until 2 in the morning helping him study for his chemistry exams. I wondered what kind of desperation could push a person to do something so cruel to his own mother. I thought about the $400,000 sitting in my handbag. I thought about the Wyoming ranch, about the $50,000 a month quietly filling that private trust. I opened my mouth, ready to tell them everything, ready to be the generous, forgiving mother who saves the day one final time. But before a single word could leave my throat, my eyes drifted down to the coffee table again, and I noticed a thick stack of papers sitting beneath the nursing home brochure. The top page was clearly visible under the bright living room lights. Durable power of attorney. My breath caught sharply in my chest. I stepped closer, scanning the dense legal text. It granted Marcus complete, unconditional control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my property, including the full legal authority to sell this house without my consent. At the bottom of the page, beside an official notary seal, was my signature. It was a perfect, flawless forgery of my own handwriting. The warmth I had felt toward my son a moment earlier turned instantly to ice. They were not simply trying to pressure me into leaving my home. They had already stolen it out from under me, weeks before I had even discovered the truth about Walter's secret fortune. I looked up slowly and met my son's eyes. He was no longer smiling. He saw exactly what I was staring at, and for a flicker of a second, something like guilt passed across his face. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a cold, defiant stubbornness that chilled me to my core. They believed I was a weak, grieving old woman who would simply crumble. They had absolutely no idea what I was carrying inside my handbag, and they had no idea what a woman who has just lost her husband and is about to lose her son in the very same month is capable of doing to protect what remains of her life. I kept my eyes locked on Marcus for a long, heavy moment before slowly raising a trembling finger toward the coffee table. I let my hand shake, playing directly into the fragile, confused image they had already decided to believe. "Marcus," I said, letting my voice waver just enough. "What is this document? Why does it have my signature on it? I do not remember signing anything since your father passed." The tension in the room shifted instantly. Marcus glanced at Danielle, silently asking her to take control of the situation, and she did not hesitate for a single second. The cold, satisfied look on her face melted away, replaced by a mask of gentle, aching sympathy that almost made me doubt my own eyes. She walked toward me slowly, reaching for a manila folder sitting beneath the coffee table. "Evelyn," she murmured softly, reaching out to touch my arm again. "We did not want to have this conversation like this. We were only trying to spare you from the reality of your medical situation." "My medical situation," I echoed, furrowing my brow. "I am perfectly healthy, Danielle. What are you talking about?" She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of hospital documents, the letterhead unmistakably from the same hospital where Walter had spent his final days. She flipped to a page and handed it to me with theatrical sadness. "We spoke with Dr. Whitfield the day Dad passed," she said gently. "He was very concerned about you, Evelyn. He pulled Marcus aside in the hallway and told him to keep a close eye on your mental state during the grieving process." I stared down at the page. It was a genuine medical record from Walter physician, but scrawled in yellow highlighter near the bottom was a handwritten note that read, "Patient wife appears to be experiencing significant cognitive strain and confusion. Recommend close supervision to prevent accidental harm." I stared at those words, trying to comprehend how they had gotten their hands on something so damning. I had barely spoken to Walter physician during those final hours, too consumed with holding Walter's hand and praying for a miracle that never came. Marcus must have cornered the doctor in the hallway, painting a tragic picture of a fragile, unstable widow slipping into madness. They had planted the seed of my supposed insanity before my husband's body was even cold. Before I could process the depth of their betrayal, Marcus stepped forward and gently took both of my hands in his. His grip was firm, almost restrictive, as though he were physically trying to anchor me to the floor. He looked into my eyes with an expression so convincingly sorrowful that for a moment I almost believed it. "Mom, you have to listen to us," he pleaded, his voice cracking with practiced emotion. "You are not well. The grief has hit you harder than you realize. You have been leaving the stove on. You left the front door wide open last week. You have stopped eating unless we put food directly in front of you. We cannot bear the thought of losing you too." None of it was true. I had never left the stove burning. I had never left the front door open. I had been perfectly capable of caring for myself every single day since Walter passed. They were constructing an entire fabricated history in real time, building an airtight legal narrative of my sudden mental collapse right there in my own living room. "I truly do not remember any of that happening," I whispered, letting my gaze drop toward the floor, playing the part of a confused, broken woman to perfection. "We know you do not remember," Danielle said softly, rubbing gentle circles into my back. That is exactly why we had to step in before you accidentally hurt yourself. I glanced back down at the forged document one final time. But my signature, I said quietly. I would never sign my entire life away without reading every word first. Marcus released my hands and took a long, deliberate breath. He looked at me with an expression of unwavering, rehearsed nobility, as though he were about to make some great personal sacrifice for my own good. We forged it to spare you the stress of the paperwork, he said, his voice thick with false conviction. We are selling the house to get you into a facility where you will be completely safe. We are only protecting you. The sheer audacity of the lie hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach across that coffee table and shake him until the truth spilled out of him. I wanted to pull the $400,000 out of my handbag and throw it directly in his face. But I did not move a single muscle. For 31 years I stood in front of a classroom full of 8-year-old children, managing chaos with quiet, unshakable calm. I learned a long time ago that panic never solves anything. It only hands your enemy more power. Right now I was staring directly into the eye of a hurricane, and if I reacted with anger, Danielle would use that very anger as proof of my supposed instability. They would call the authorities, present the forged documents, and have me legally dragged out of my own home before the sun went down. I realized with a cold, sharpening clarity that the only way to survive this trap was to convince them it had already worked. I had to become the exact fragile, broken woman they needed me to be. I let out a long, shaky breath, deliberately letting my shoulders slump forward. You really think this is for the best, Marcus? I asked softly, my voice trembling with practiced confusion. Marcus seized the opening instantly, placing his hands on my shoulders with a firm, patronizing grip. I know it is hard to hear, Mom, but yes, we truly believe this is the safest path for you. The facility we found is wonderful. You will not have to worry about maintaining this big empty house anymore. Let us handle everything, Danielle added, her voice dripping with sweetness. We will pack your clothes and a few photographs of Dad to bring with you. You do not need to lift a finger. I nodded slowly, deliberately making my movements sluggish and unsure. I am just so tired, I murmured, letting my words blur together. I miss him so much. Nothing makes sense without him. We know, Mom, Marcus said, patting my shoulder with hollow affection. Go lie down. We will finish here and wake you for dinner. I turned and shuffled slowly down the long hallway toward my bedroom, dragging my feet across the hardwood floor, letting every step look heavy and defeated. Every part of me wanted to turn around and fight, but my mind forced my body to keep playing the role. The moment my bedroom door clicked shut behind me, the frightened, broken widow disappeared completely. I stood up straight. My breathing steadied. My mind sharpened into something cold and focused. I quietly locked the door, walked to my closet, and slid my handbag deep beneath a stack of folded winter sweaters on the top shelf. I sat down on the edge of my bed and listened to the muffled sounds of my furniture being carried out of the house I had spent 44 years building. I needed proof. I needed to understand exactly why they were rushing to steal a house they had never shown any interest in before. People only resort to something this desperate when they are backed into a corner they cannot escape any other way. Before I settled in for the night, I slipped out to the back porch with my old cordless phone and dialed Ruth's number, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. She answered on the second ring, and the moment she heard the shake in my voice, she asked what was wrong. I told her everything as quietly and quickly as I could. The movers, the forged document, the brochure for the facility, the way Marcus had gripped my hands and called it protection. Ruth was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone hard and steady in a way I had never heard from her before. She told me she had suspected something was wrong for weeks, that she had seen Danielle's car parked outside my house late at night on more than one occasion when she knew I was already asleep. She told me not to trust a single word coming out of either of their mouths, and she told me that whatever I decided to do, I was not going to face it alone. Having her voice in my ear that night gave me something I desperately needed, the simple, grounding reminder that I was not imagining any of this, that I was not losing my mind the way they wanted me to believe. I thanked her, wiped my eyes, and slipped back inside before Marcus or Danielle could notice I had been gone. I stayed in my room for the rest of the evening. When Danielle knocked with a plate of bland chicken and rice, I accepted it with a weak, grateful smile, playing my part perfectly, leaving most of the food untouched to reinforce the story of my decline. Night eventually fell, wrapping the half-empty house in heavy silence. Marcus and Danielle slept in the guest room to keep an eye on the property, and presumably to keep an eye on me. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, my mind turning through every possible next move. Around 2 a.m, my throat felt dry. I quietly slipped out of bed and padded barefoot down the hallway toward the kitchen, moving through the darkness without needing a single light, since I knew every inch of this house by heart. As I filled a glass with water at the sink, a faint flicker of light through the window caught my attention. I looked out toward the backyard patio and saw Danielle standing outside in the cold night air, illuminated only by the pale glow of her phone screen. She was pacing back and forth, her arms crossing and uncrossing in sharp, agitated movements, whispering furiously into the phone. I pressed myself against the wall beside the window, holding my breath. The cadence of her voice was wrong for a conversation with her husband. She sounded defensive one moment and sharply demanding the next, exactly like a negotiation falling apart in real time. She ended the call abruptly, shoved the phone into her pocket, and stood staring out at the dark yard for a long moment. Then she reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small orange pill bottle I recognized instantly. It was the memory supplement she had gifted me earlier that week, insisting the natural vitamins would help clear the fog of my grief. She had even bought me a weekly pill organizer, carefully sorting the capsules herself so I would not have to worry about remembering my dose. I watched in frozen horror as she opened the bottle, pulled apart the capsules one by one, and dumped the contents into the dirt beneath the rose bushes Walter had planted years earlier. She then pulled a small plastic bag from her jacket, filled with a crushed white powder, and began carefully refilling each empty capsule with the unknown substance. My stomach turned violently. The mental fog I had been feeling for the past 2 weeks, the strange exhaustion, the small gaps in my memory, none of it was grief. It was chemistry. It was poison, quietly refilled into my daily vitamins to manufacture exactly the symptoms they needed to justify locking me away and declaring me unfit to manage my own life. I retreated silently back to my room before she came back inside, pressing myself flat against the cold wall until her footsteps passed. I did not sleep a single minute for the rest of that night. The following morning I accepted my daily pill from Danielle with trembling fingers, exactly as I always had. I placed it under my tongue instead of swallowing it, and the moment she turned to check her phone, I spit it discreetly into a napkin and slipped it into my robe pocket. Once they left for work, I marched straight to Marcus' home office, sat down at his computer, and unlocked it using the name of his childhood dog followed by his college graduation year, a password he had used for as long as I could remember. What I found made my blood run cold. His browser history was filled with searches about offshore banking, private island real estate, and expedited residency programs. His financial dashboard revealed staggering debt, maxed-out credit cards, and a final notice from an unregulated lending company demanding immediate repayment of an $800,000 loan. They were drowning in debt from failed investments, and they needed the money from my house to pay it off before disappearing entirely. I opened his email and found a thread with an unlicensed real estate broker. In a message sent the previous night, Danielle had written that the house needed to be listed 30% below market value, that they did not care about a fair price, only that the cash clear by Friday, and that the old woman was too confused to know what she was signing anyway. I kept scrolling, unable to stop myself even as my stomach turned with every new discovery. There were messages between Marcus and Danielle discussing which of my belongings held any resale value, casual and businesslike, as though they were dividing up the contents of a stranger estate sale rather than the home their own family had shared for decades. There was a folder on the desktop labeled simply Restful Pines, filled with photographs of the facility brochure and a list of admission requirements, none of which included my consent. I sat there in his leather chair, my hands shaking with a fury I had never felt in my entire life. That evening, a knock at the door revealed a large, heavily tattooed man who forced his way inside the moment I hesitated. He gripped my collar and pinned me against the wall, hissing that Marcus needed to pay his $800,000 debt by Friday, or the house would burn to the ground with all of us inside it. His grip was so tight I could feel my pulse pounding beneath his fingers, and for one terrifying moment I truly believed I was going to die right there in my own hallway, over a debt I had never even known existed. He released me and walked out just as suddenly as he arrived, leaving me gasping on the floor of my own hallway, my hands trembling so badly I could barely push myself back up onto my feet. I sat on the floor for a long time after the front door slammed shut, staring at the ceiling, waiting for my heart to slow down. I understood then that this was no longer simply about a stolen house or a forged signature. This was about survival, plain and simple, and I could not afford to make a single mistake. I knew then that I could not simply wait and hope for the situation to resolve itself. I needed to act, and I needed to act quickly. That night I told Marcus and Danielle I had decided to accept the move, but that I needed one final trip to visit my sister grave in Nebraska before saying goodbye to everything. Relieved to have me out of the house, Danielle eagerly booked me a bus ticket for the next morning. I let her drop me at the station, waited until her car disappeared, and then took a taxi straight to the airport instead, boarding a direct flight to Wyoming using an emergency credit card Walter and I had kept for exactly this kind of unexpected situation. The flight itself felt like stepping outside of my own body. I stared out the small oval window at the clouds drifting beneath the wing, thinking about Walter, about the version of him that had once stood in a lawyer office decades ago, quietly deciding to protect our family in a way I would only understand after he was gone. I thought about how strange it was that grief and rage could sit so closely together inside a single chest, taking turns rising to the surface with every passing mile. When the plane finally landed and I stepped out into the open Wyoming air, something in my body simply released. The sky out there stretched wider than anything I had ever seen back home, pale blue fading into gold along the horizon. Standing on the edge of that massive ranch for the first time, surrounded by rolling plains and distant mountains, I felt something inside me steady for the first time in weeks. I walked into the nearby town and found the office of the attorney who had managed the property for Walter Estate for years, a sharp, composed woman named Renata Cole. I laid everything out for her: the forged power of attorney, the fake nursing home threat, the poison capsules, the unlicensed broker, the violent debt collector, all of it. I told her I had less than 48 hours before Marcus and Danielle would try to sell my house out from under me. Renata listened carefully, taking notes on a legal pad without once interrupting me, and when I finally finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and fierce determination that steadied me more than anything else had in weeks. She told me that in 30 years of practicing law she had seen greed destroy families in every possible way, but rarely with this much calculation. She explained that a power of attorney, even a forged one, can only control property that a person still legally owns. If I no longer owned the house, there would be nothing left for them to sell. Within hours, using a portion of the cash from the safe deposit box, we created a private holding company, one with no public trace back to my name, protected by layers of legal structuring. I signed the documents transferring my Chicago area house entirely into that company, out of my own name forever. I flew back home that same night, resurrecting my fragile, confused persona the moment the taxi pulled into my driveway. Danielle greeted me with fake warmth and asked about my trip, while Marcus watched closely to see whether the poison was still doing its job. I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. The next evening they placed a stack of closing documents in front of me, telling me a buyer had already been found and the sale would close the following morning. I signed with a deliberately shaky, illegible scrawl, and watched the flicker of greedy satisfaction pass between them as they tucked the papers away, completely unaware they were celebrating the sale of a house that no longer belonged to me. That night, once their bedroom door clicked shut upstairs, I planted a small recording device beneath the coffee table where they always gathered to talk. I retreated to my room, slipped in the wireless earpiece, and waited. Just after 2 a.m, their voices drifted clearly into my ear. Marcus spoke first, his voice thick with relief, marveling at how easily I had signed the papers without reading a single word. Danielle laughed and said the dosage in my capsules had done exactly what it was supposed to do, that my signature looked like it had been drawn by someone half asleep. They discussed the closing the next morning, the wire transfer that would pay off their debt, and the tickets they had already purchased to leave the country by the end of the week. Then Marcus' voice dropped low and uncertain, asking what would happen to me once the sale went through. Danielle explained coldly that she had already arranged for a transport van to take me to a locked psychiatric facility on Friday morning, one with no visitors and no phone privileges. Somewhere I would simply disappear while they were already settled into a new life on the other side of the world. I sat frozen in the darkness, my chest aching, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Marcus' voice grew quieter, trembling with something that almost sounded like guilt. He asked what would happen if the hospital ever released Dad full medical records, if I ever learned the truth about what really happened in his final hours. My entire body went cold. I had no idea what he meant. Walter had died from a sudden infection the doctors could not control in time. There was nothing left to discover. Danielle's voice sharpened instantly, warning him to keep quiet, insisting no one would ever find out anything. Marcus pressed further, his voice cracking. He said that Walter kept trying to reach for the nurse call button in those final hours, that he was still fighting, still trying to hold on, and that they had told the hospital staff Walter had a clear directive against extended life support, a directive he had never actually signed. I gripped the edge of my nightstand so hard my knuckles turned white. The room spun around me. A memory surged forward without warning, sharp and vivid, of sitting beside Walter hospital bed on that final night, watching his fingers twitch weakly toward the call button on the side rail, watching a nurse gently guide his hand back down and tell me softly that he was simply restless, that it was normal at this stage. I had believed her completely. I had thanked her. I had no idea I was thanking someone who had been given false instructions by my own son. Danielle's explanation came next, delivered with a calm, chilling detachment that made my stomach turn. She said Walter had mentioned wanting to update his will after learning about a health scare weeks earlier, that he had spoken to a different attorney about placing the majority of his assets into a trust that would have completely cut off their access to any inheritance. She said they could not risk losing everything, so they told the hospital administration that I was too emotionally compromised to make medical decisions, used their emergency authority as listed relatives, and quietly signed the paperwork ending his treatment 2 days earlier than the doctors had recommended. They had taken my husband from me. Not illness, not fate. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, and the grief that had been crushing me for 3 weeks evaporated completely, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. I was no longer a mourning wife. I was a woman who had just uncovered a murder. I thought about every sacrifice Walter and I had made for that boy, every late night helping with homework, every dollar spent on his education, every ounce of love we poured into raising him. And in return, he had helped end his own father life 2 days early to protect a fortune he had not even earned. I removed the earpiece with trembling hands and sat in absolute silence, letting the fury settle into something sharp and focused. I was no longer simply protecting my house or my freedom. I was going to make certain they paid for every single thing they had taken from this family. The rest of that night I packed a small bag and pressed my Navy suit for the following morning. I did not sleep. I mentally walked through every step of what needed to happen, coordinating quietly by phone with Renata, who had already alerted federal investigators about the fraud, the forged documents, and the wire transfer scheme crossing state lines. The next morning I watched from a distance as Marcus and Danielle left the house dressed sharply, heading downtown to finalize the sale of a property they no longer owned. I followed at a careful distance and arrived at the real estate office just before their meeting began. I stood quietly near the elevators as Renata arrived, briefcase in hand, followed closely by 2 federal agents. Together we walked into the glass conference room where Marcus and Danielle sat waiting eagerly for a buyer who would never come. The moment they saw me standing there in my Navy suit instead of my robe, the color drained from both of their faces. Renata stepped forward and calmly explained that the holding company now owning the house had recently purchased their entire $800,000 debt directly from the lender, making the company their sole creditor, and that immediate repayment was now legally required. For one brief, foolish second Marcus looked almost relieved, believing I had somehow rescued them. Then Renata delivered the final blow, explaining that the house they were attempting to sell no longer belonged to either of them, that I had legally transferred it out of my name weeks earlier, and that everything they had signed, everything they had forged, applied to nothing at all. Danielle's face went pale as the federal agents stepped forward. The unlicensed broker sitting at the head of the table pushed his chair back and raised both hands, stammering that he had no idea any of this was connected to fraud, that he was simply hired to list a property. Nobody paid him any attention. They were placed under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and attempted theft, the cold metal handcuffs clicking shut around their wrists as shocked onlookers in the office watched in stunned silence. Danielle began weeping, her makeup streaking down her cheeks, begging the agents to wait, insisting there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Nobody in that room believed her, least of all me. Marcus fell to his knees, sobbing, begging me to stop this, telling me I could not do this to him, that he was still my son. I looked down at him, searching my heart for any trace of the boy I had raised. I found none left worth saving. This house stopped belonging to you weeks ago, I told him, my voice steady and cold. And you stopped being my son the day you decided your father's final hours were less important than a fortune he never wanted you to have this way. He knew then that I had heard everything. The agents led them both away in handcuffs while I stood perfectly still, watching the life they had built on lies collapse completely in a matter of minutes. In the weeks that followed, I sat through hours of interviews with federal investigators, walking them through every detail, every document, every recording. It was exhausting in a way I had not expected, reliving the betrayal over and over again for strangers taking careful notes across a metal table. But every single time, I reminded myself that this exhaustion was the price of the truth finally being heard, and I paid it willingly. Ruth sat beside me during the first 2 interviews, holding my hand under the table while I answered questions about my own son in a flat, steady voice that surprised even me. She told me afterward that she had never been more proud of anyone in her entire life, and I let myself cry in the car for the first time since everything had begun, not out of grief this time, but out of sheer relief. The investigation that followed uncovered even more than I expected. The hospital directive they had forged became central evidence in a separate criminal case regarding Walter's death, one that is still working its way through the courts, but one that will finally give him the justice he deserves. The violent debt collector who threatened my life was swept up in a related federal investigation targeting the underground lending operation Marcus had borrowed from, and that dangerous network was permanently dismantled. As for the house, I could not bear the thought of ever stepping inside those walls again. The memories there had been poisoned by greed and betrayal. Instead, I donated the property to a local non-profit, and it has since been converted into a support center for elderly individuals who have experienced abuse or abandonment at the hands of their own families. The exact house where my son tried to discard me now stands as a place of protection for people just like me. 3 months have passed since that morning in the glass conference room. I am standing now on the wide wooden porch of the ranch Walter left me, watching the sun rise slowly over the mountains in the distance. The air out here is clean and quiet in a way the city never was. A small herd of horses moves gently across the far pasture, and somewhere beyond the ridge, machinery hums steadily, still generating the income that will secure the rest of my life. I do not feel broken anymore. For the first time since Walter passed, I feel whole. I feel him here with me in the wind moving through the grass, in the golden light spreading slowly across the fields. I know somewhere he is proud of the choices I made to protect the truth and protect myself. Ruth flew out to visit me last month, and we sat on this very porch drinking coffee until the sun went down, talking about everything and nothing the way old friends do. She told me she had never seen me look so at peace, and I believed her because for the first time in years I finally felt like myself again. Not a wife defined by grief, not a mother defined by disappointment, simply Evelyn, standing on her own land, breathing her own air. Some nights I still write letters to Walter, sitting at the small desk by the window, telling him about the horses, about the sunsets, about the quiet satisfaction of watching justice finally catch up to the people who tried to erase us both. I do not know if he can hear me, but writing those words makes the distance between us feel a little smaller, and some days that is enough. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love should never make you blind to the truth sitting right in front of you. I spent my entire life giving everything I had to my family, And it was easy, even natural, to overlook the warning signs of entitlement and greed hiding beneath the surface. But real wisdom comes with time, and with the painful understanding that trust has to be earned again and again, never simply assumed. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most wear the most familiar faces. Do not let love turn you into someone easy to take advantage of. Stand up for yourself. Protect what you have built. And never let the people who betray you write the final chapter of your story. If Evelyn's story kept you here until the very end, drop a comment below and tell me exactly how you would have handled Marcus and Danielle. And if you believe every mother deserves this kind of justice, hit subscribe right now because there are many more stories just like this one still to come.